Even now, years after everything happened, I still can't shake the chill that comes whenever I think of that night. The night Adaeze came back. The way she looked, standing at the edge of the village in the moonlight, her eyes hollow, her skin so pale, her lips moving in whispers that only she could hear. I can still see it all so clearly, as if it were yesterday. I remember her lips trembling as she whispered to me, "He's coming for me." There was terror in her voice that I'd never heard before, something that even now I struggle to explain. She didn't look like the Adaeze I'd known my whole life. That night was the beginning of the end. But the truth is, the story didn't begin there. It had started long before, with the river and the shadows that danced at its edge. I have to tell this story. Maybe it's the only way I'll find peace. Maybe it's the only way I can give Adaeze the peace she never got. Listen closely, because this story is not just for me or for Adaeze. It's for anyone who has ever been drawn to the unknown, for anyone who's felt that chill, that warning in the back of their mind. Spirits are real, and once they have you, they don't let go. I grew up in a small village on the edge of the forest. We were a close community, bound together by customs and stories that had been passed down for generations. People here knew there were things we did and things we didn't do, lines we didn't cross, places we didn't go. We knew the forest held secrets, and we were careful, respectful. The old tales were our warnings, but they weren't just stories. They were woven into our lives, and anyone with sense heeded them. Adaeze was different, though. She was born with a light inside her, a brightness that drew people to her, like a moth to a flame. I can still picture her laughing under the sun, her eyes sparkling, her hair catching the light. She was beautiful, and not just in looks. She had a spirit about her that made people smile, made them forget their worries for a while. But with that, light came a boldness, a stubbornness that made her stand out even more. I'd known her since we were children, and though we were close, there was always something unreachable about her. Even then, she wasn't afraid of the things that scared the rest of us. Where others saw warnings, Adizi saw invitations. She'd scoff at the tales our parents told us, the stories meant to keep us safe. One day, we were about 8 or 9, and we were playing near the edge of the forest. I remember how she'd wandered a little too far, her feet touching the edge of the shadow where the forest grew dark and thick. I shouted at her, warning her not to go too close, but she just looked back at me and laughed. "Why should I fear something I can't see?" she'd said, her voice so confident, so carefree. She was daring the spirits to prove her wrong. That was Adaeze, beautiful, bold, and fearless, the kind of girl you couldn't help but admire, even if you didn't always understand her. And maybe that's why, as we grew older, no one could truly claim her heart. It was like she was waiting for something the rest of us couldn't see. As the years went by, our village changed. We all grew up, taking on responsibilities, finding our paths in life. I started working with my father, learning the trade of farming, and others found their own roles. But Adaeze remained untouched, almost as if time itself couldn't touch her. She had no interest in marriage, no interest in settling down. The other young men admired her from afar, but she never seemed to notice. She had a light in her that couldn't be contained, a spirit that was wild and free. And then came the day she went to the river alone. That was where it all began. That was the day Adizi's fate changed, though none of us knew it then. It was a warm evening, the sun setting low in the sky, casting everything in shades of gold and pink. The air was thick and heavy, almost stifling, and most of the villagers had already returned to their homes, escaping the heat. But Adaeze had gone to fetch water, even though everyone knew that the river was not a place to be alone at dusk. I remember that day well because the village felt strange. There was a heaviness in the air, a quietness that didn't sit right. The birds had gone silent, and even the leaves seemed still, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Mama Nkechi, Adaeze's mother, paced at the edge of the village, her brow creased with worry. "Where is that girl?" she muttered, glancing toward the river. I could see the fear in her eyes, though she tried to hide it. "She'll be back soon," I said, trying to reassure her, though I didn't feel reassured myself. Something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but there was a tightness in my chest, like a warning, a feeling that something was about to happen. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a chill settled over the village. People began to look at each other, whispering, casting uneasy glances toward the river. When dusk fell, you could feel the tension in the air, a silent reminder of the unseen forces that watched over us. Then, just as the first stars appeared in the sky, Adizi returned. She walked slowly, her figure barely visible in the fading light. I ran to her, relief flooding me. But as I got closer, I realized something was different. She looked distant, like her mind was somewhere far away. Her skin was pale, her eyes unfocused, and there was a faint smile on her lips. A strange, haunting smile that sent a chill down my spine. "Adizi," I called, reaching out to steady her. "Where were you? You had everyone worried." She looked at me, her gaze unfocused, almost as if she didn't recognize me. I met someone," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words made my heart skip a beat. Who did you meet?" She shook her head slowly, her smile widening ever so slightly. "Someone beautiful. Someone unlike anyone I've ever met." The way she said it, with that faraway look in her eyes, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to press her, to understand, but she only shook her head again, as if the words couldn't be spoken. I felt an unease settle over me, a sense that something was deeply wrong, but I couldn't place it. "Come on," I said gently, taking her hand. "Let's get you home. Your mother is worried." She didn't resist, but as we walked, she kept looking over her shoulder, as if expecting to see someone following us. And every time she looked back, a shiver ran down my spine, though I didn't dare turn around. That night, Adaeze said nothing more about the encounter. She went to bed without a word, leaving me with 1,000 questions and a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I lay awake long into the night, wondering who she had met by the river, and why the thought of it filled me with such fear. In the days that followed, Adaeze was no longer the same. It was subtle at first, just a certain quietness, a sense that her mind was somewhere else. She would sit by the river for hours, staring into the water, humming a strange melody that none of us had ever heard before. It was haunting, that tune almost like a lullaby, and whenever I heard it, I felt an inexplicable sadness, a heaviness that settled over me like a dark cloud. The other villagers began to notice the change too. Adaeze, who had once been the light of the village, was now distant, withdrawn, her laughter gone, replaced by that eerie melody. Her mother tried to reach her, to ask her what was wrong, but Adaeze would only smile, that same haunting smile, and say nothing. I remember one night, I saw her standing at the edge of the forest, staring into the darkness. Her hair was loose, her clothes hanging off her thin frame, and her eyes. They were wide, almost wild, as if she were looking for something, someone in the shadows. "Adizi," I called softly, approaching her carefully. "What are you doing out here?" She turned to me slowly, her expression blank, her eyes empty. "I'm waiting for him," she said simply. A shiver ran through me, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "Who are you waiting for?" She looked back into the forest, a dreamy smile on her lips. "My husband." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I tried to reason with her, reminding her of the young men in the village who admired her, but she only shook her head, that same distant smile on her lips. "No," she whispered. "He's different. He's not like anyone here." She turned back to the forest, her gaze locked on something I couldn't see. "You wouldn't understand," she said softly, almost as if talking to herself. I left her there that night, standing alone at the edge of the forest, waiting for someone who, in my heart, I knew wasn't from this world. I wanted to pull her back, to bring her back to us, but she was slipping away, lost in a world only she could see. The days stretched on, and the changes in Adaeze only grew more alarming. She'd been a girl full of laughter, of warmth, but now it was as if her very soul had been drained, replaced by something cold and distant. Her once bright skin was pallid, her eyes hollow, and she moved through the village like a ghost. People began to avoid her. Even her friends who used to adore her now kept their distance, whispering about the way she would stand for hours by the river, her gaze locked on the horizon, waiting for someone only she could see. It wasn't just the adults who murmured their fears. Even the children started to notice, pointing and whispering whenever she passed. "She's been touched by a spirit," they would say, shivering, as if her very presence sent chills down their spines. But it wasn't just her strange behavior that worried me. It was her appearance. She was changing, in ways that couldn't be explained. Her hair, once thick and shining, now looked limp, almost brittle, and her once rosy cheeks were hollow. It was as if something was slowly siphoning the life out of her. One evening, I couldn't bear it anymore. I went to her house, hoping to speak to her alone. Her mother, Mama Nkechi, looked at me with tears in her eyes as she opened the door. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her face told me everything. She was just as helpless as the rest of us, watching her daughter slip away with no way to stop it. "Adizi's in her room," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. Maybe she'll listen to you." I nodded and went to Adizi's room, my heart pounding in my chest. As I opened the door, I found her sitting by the window, staring out into the night. She didn't turn as I entered, didn't acknowledge me at all, as if I were a mere shadow in the room. "Adize," I said softly, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Please, tell me what's happening. Tell me who you're waiting for." She was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on something far away, something only she could see. Then, in a voice so soft I could barely hear her, she spoke. "He's my husband," she murmured, her voice dreamlike. "He chose me. He told me I belonged to him." The words sent a chill through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Adaeze," I said, stepping closer. "There's no one out there. You don't belong to anyone but yourself." She turned to me then, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "You don't understand," she whispered, her tone filled with an eerie certainty. "He's not like us. He's something else, and he loves me." Her words left me speechless, and for a moment, all I could do was stare at her, a girl I thought I knew, who now seemed like a stranger. I wanted to pull her back, to bring her back to reality, but I didn't know how. Not long after that night, Adizi started wearing a ring. It was small, delicate, with a strange gold band that seemed to shimmer faintly in the light, almost as if it were alive. No one had seen it before, not even her mother, and when we asked her about it, she would only smile, tracing her finger over it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. One day, I worked up the courage to ask her directly. "Where did you get that ring?" I asked, keeping my tone gentle, hoping she'd let her guard down. She looked at me, that same dreamy smile on her lips. "He gave it to me," she replied softly, her voice filled with an eerie sort of happiness. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "My husband," she said, her tone as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She held up her hand, admiring the ring with a look of pride, of love. "He put it on my finger himself. It's our bond." I wanted to reach out, to pull the ring off her finger, to throw it as far away as I could, but something held me back. The ring seemed to glow faintly, as if it were part of her, bound to her in a way that couldn't be undone. "You can't take it off," she murmured. as if reading my thoughts. "It's a part of me now." Her words made my heart ache with helplessness. I couldn't understand what had happened, couldn't grasp how she had come to believe in this. This spirit that only she could see. But deep down, a part of me knew that this wasn't just in her mind. There was something dark and real at work, something that had taken hold of her and wouldn't let go. After that day, I couldn't keep silent any longer. I went to the village elder, Papa Uche, a man known for his wisdom and knowledge of the old ways. If anyone could help Adizi, it was him. Papa Uche listened to me carefully, his face grave as I told him everything I'd seen, everything she'd told me. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long time, his eyes distant, as if he was seeing something beyond the present. "This is a serious matter," he said finally, his voice low and filled with a weight I couldn't ignore. "There are spirits in this world who desire beauty, who are drawn to the light within certain people. It sounds as if Adaeze has caught the eye of one of them, and such spirits, they do not let go easily." A chill ran through me at his words. "Is there anything we can do?" I asked, desperate for any solution, any hope. Papa Uche nodded slowly, though his expression was grave. "There is a way. We must perform a cleansing ritual, a separation ritual, to break the bond between her and this spirit. But it will not be easy. She must want to be freed. If she resists, if she clings to him, the ritual will fail." I knew then that this would be the hardest part. Adaeze had embraced this spirit, had welcomed him into her life. She believed in him, loved him, and the thought of letting him go would be unbearable for her. But I had to try. I couldn't let her slip away without a fight. When I told Adaeze about the ritual, she reacted just as I'd feared. She laughed, a soft, haunting sound, as if the very idea was absurd. "A ritual?" she said, shaking her head. "You can't break a bond like this. He chose me, and I chose him. No ritual can change that." "Please, Adaeze," I begged, my voice trembling. "This isn't right. He's taking you away from us, from the people who love you. Can't you see that?" She looked at me with sad, pitying eyes, as if I were the one who didn't understand. "You don't know him like I do," she said softly. "He's kind, gentle. He loves me in a way no one else ever could." Her words cut deep, and for a moment, I felt a surge of anger, of frustration. "This isn't love, Adaeze," I said, my voice harsh. It's something else, something dark. He's taking everything from you." Her gaze softened, and she reached out, touching my hand with a tenderness that made my heart ache. "I know you care about me," she said gently, "but you don't understand. He's always with me, even now." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I refused to give up. I went to her mother, Mama Ankechi, who was just as desperate as I was. Together, we pleaded with her, begged her to agree to the ritual, to give it a chance. Finally, after hours of pleading, she relented, though her expression was cold, resigned. "Fine," she said quietly, "I'll do it, but don't expect it to change anything." We took her silence as a victory, though a hollow one. She didn't believe the ritual would work, didn't want it to work. But we held on to hope, fragile though it was. The night of the ritual was dark, the sky overcast, with thick clouds blocking the moonlight. We gathered in Papa Uche's hut, a small circle of villagers who dared to defy the spirit's hold. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs, a blend of sage and other sacred plants meant to ward off evil. Candles were arranged in a circle around Adaeze, who sat in the center, her face pale, her expression unreadable. Papa Uche began chanting, his voice low and rhythmic, calling upon the protective spirits to break the bond that held Adizi captive. The words were old, passed down from generation to generation, filled with a power that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The candles flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls, and the room felt colder, as if something unseen was watching. Adaeze sat silently, her eyes closed, her face serene. For a moment, I thought she might have given in, might be willing to let go. But then, as Papa Uche's chanting grew louder, she stiffened, her body tense, her eyes snapping open. "He's here," she whispered, her voice filled with fear. "He's watching us." A chill filled the air, and I felt a presence, dark and oppressive, settling over us. The temperature dropped, and the flames flickered wildly, as if they too were frightened. I could hear a low whispering, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Mine!" it hissed, the word echoing in my mind like a curse. "She is mine!" Adizi screamed, her body convulsing, as if something was pulling at her, trying to drag her away. Papa Uche continued chanting, his voice louder, more desperate, but the shadows only grew darker, closing in around us. As Adaeze's scream echoed through the room, my heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. Her body shook violently, her face twisted in a mixture of fear and pain. Papa Uche's chanting grew louder, a desperate plea that filled the small hut, his voice trembling as he called upon every protective spirit to come to our aid. The shadows in the room thickened, almost becoming tangible, pressing down on us like a suffocating weight. My breath came shallow, my skin prickling with a cold I couldn't explain. It was as though something far more powerful than any of us had anticipated was standing in that room, watching, waiting. I could feel him, this husband of Adizi's, this spirit who had claimed her. He was everywhere and nowhere, a presence so dark that it made the shadows seem light, and his anger was palpable, a burning rage that seemed to shake the very walls around us. Adaeze's eyes snapped open, wide and terrified, her gaze locking onto mine. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "He's coming. He won't let me go." I reached out, taking her hand, trying to ground her, to bring her back to me. "Adize," I whispered, my voice choked with desperation. "You don't have to go with him. We're here. We'll protect you." For a brief moment, her grip tightened, and I saw a flicker of the old Adaeze, the girl I'd known, the girl who had once been full of life and laughter. But then, her gaze shifted, her face contorted in pain, and her body convulsed again. The candles around us flickered, the flames almost snuffing out entirely, and in the dim light, I saw a shadow move, a figure standing just behind Adizi, tall and dark, with eyes like black pools, watching us with a gaze that felt like a curse. "He's here," she whispered, her voice trembling, filled with a fear that sent a chill down my spine. "He's watching." Papa Uche's chanting intensified, his voice filled with an urgency that bordered on desperation. He moved closer, sprinkling a handful of herbs around Adaeze, creating a protective barrier meant to keep the spirit at bay. But I could feel it, the spirit's power pushing against the barrier, pressing in, relentless, unyielding. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and I could hear a low whisper, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing in the depths of my mind. "She is mine," the voice hissed, cold and cruel, a sound that filled me with a sense of dread unlike anything I'd ever felt. "You cannot take her from me." Adize's face twisted in pain, and she let out a scream, her body convulsing violently. I tightened my grip on her hand, holding on with all the strength I had, desperate to keep her grounded, to keep her with us. But the shadows only grew darker, more oppressive, filling the room with a darkness that felt alive, crawling over us, suffocating. And in that moment, I knew we were losing her. After what felt like an eternity, the shadows receded, and the oppressive presence began to fade. Adaeze collapsed in my arms, her breathing shallow, her skin pale and cold to the touch. Papa Uche's chanting slowed, his voice a mere whisper, filled with exhaustion and sorrow. We sat in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy shroud. Adaeze was barely conscious, her eyes half open, her body limp. I could see the toll it had taken on her, the way the spirit's hold had drained her of life. I looked at Papa Uche, my heart pounding in my chest. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice trembling. Papa Uche shook his head, his face etched with sadness. "The bond has been weakened, but it is not broken," he said softly. "The spirit still holds her. He will not let go." A cold dread filled me, and I tightened my grip on Adaeze, feeling the helplessness settle over me. We had tried everything, and it still wasn't enough. This spirit, this husband, had a hold on her that was unbreakable. Adaeze stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and for a moment, I thought I saw a glimmer of hope. But as she looked at me, I could see the truth in her gaze, a sorrow so deep that it made my heart ache. "He's not gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can still feel him, waiting." Her words tore through me, filling me with a despair I couldn't shake. I wanted to tell her it would be okay, that we'd find a way to save her, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. Not after everything we'd seen, everything we'd felt. In the days that followed the ritual, Adizi became even more withdrawn, her body weakened, her spirit fading. She barely spoke, and when she did, her words were strange, disjointed, as if she were talking to someone I couldn't see. She would sit by the river for hours, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her lips moving in silent conversation, and at night, I could hear her talking in her sleep, murmuring words I couldn't understand, her voice filled with a longing, a sadness that made my heart ache. I tried to reach her, to bring her back, but it was as though she was slipping further and further away, lost in a world only she could see. She was haunted, bound to a spirit that had claimed her, a spirit that would never let her go. One night, as I sat by the river, watching her from a distance, she turned to me, her eyes filled with tears. "He's coming for me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This time, he won't let me go." I felt a chill run down my spine, and I moved closer, reaching out to take her hand. "Adaeze, please," I said softly, my voice choked with emotion. "We can find a way. We don't have to give up." But she only shook her head, her gaze distant, filled with a sadness that I couldn't understand. "It's too late," she murmured. "He's already claimed me. I belong to him now." Her words were a knife to my heart, and I tightened my grip on her hand, desperate to hold on, to keep her grounded, to keep her with us. But I could feel it, the pull of the spirit, the way it drew her closer and closer, pulling her into a world I couldn't reach. The night Adizi left was the darkest I've ever known. The air was heavy, the sky overcast, with thick clouds that blocked out the moonlight. The village was silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. I found her by the river, standing at the edge of the water, her figure barely visible in the shadows. She looked almost ethereal, like a ghost, her skin pale, her eyes hollow, as if she were already halfway gone. "Adizi," I called, my voice trembling, filled with a desperation I couldn't hide. "Please, don't go." She turned to me, her gaze filled with a sadness so deep it broke my heart. "I have to," she whispered. "He's waiting." I reached out, taking her hand, pulling her close. "You don't have to do this," I said, my voice choked with tears. "We can find a way. We can save you." But she only shook her head, her gaze distant, resigned. "You don't understand," she murmured. "He's not just a spirit. He's a part of me now. I can feel him, even now, calling me, and I can't resist him." Her words filled me with a helplessness I couldn't bear. I wanted to save her, to pull her back, but I knew deep down that it was too late. This spirit, this husband, had claimed her in a way that I couldn't fight, in a way that even the strongest rituals couldn't break. She looked at me one last time, her gaze filled with sorrow. "Promise me you'll remember me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Remember the girl I used to be?" I nodded, my heart breaking, and as I watched her turn and walk into the forest, disappearing into the shadows, I knew I'd never see her again. Adaeze never returned. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and eventually, the village accepted that she was gone. Some said she'd been taken by the spirits, that she was now a part of their world. Others whispered that she'd been cursed, that she'd brought misfortune upon herself by defying the old ways. But I knew the truth. I knew that Adizi had been claimed by something darker, something that had taken hold of her in a way I couldn't understand. And though I tried to forget, to move on, her memory stayed with me, haunting me like a ghost. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I'd walk by the river, hoping to see her, to hear her voice, to feel her presence. And sometimes, just sometimes, I'd hear a faint whisper, a voice carried by the wind calling my name. I'd turn, my heart pounding, but there would be nothing there, only shadows and silence, a reminder of the girl who had been taken, of the spirit who had claimed her. I tell this story now as a warning, as a reminder that there are things in this world we don't understand, things that are drawn to beauty, to innocence, to light. The spirits are real, and they are watching, waiting for those who dare to cross their path. So if you ever feel a presence, if you ever hear a voice calling your name in the dark, remember Adaeze's story, do not answer. For once a spirit chooses you, it never lets go.